So best to speak into this microphone?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's for the room,
Yeah.
and that's for the Zoom. They're both.
Oh, okay.
You can just copy.
Okay. So it's okay.
Probably better to be here.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everybody. We're going to get started.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. Great to see you all. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Mahesh Srinivasan. I'm a professor here in the psychology department. And along with Professor Supreet Kaur, I'm co-scientific director of the Psychology and Economics of Poverty Initiative through the Center for Effective Global Action, lots of words there, here at Berkeley. Unfortunately, Professor Kaur can't make it here. She woke up with a high fever, so she's really bummed, but she's definitely here in spirit, and I will do my best. Very imperfect facsimile of her today. So we started our PEP program here in 2018, and it's been helping to support a growing interdisciplinary community of people who are really interested in developing insights about the psychological consequences of poverty and downstream impacts on economic development. We're really excited to host our 5th annual convening today. And really, I've seen how this meeting has grown over the years. We have about 500 people, I believe, registered either in person or online. So it's become a great community. So together, Supreet and I, along with our amazing program manager, Christina Halez, who's here, we direct the intellectual course for the initiative. We raise funds, we try to lead projects, and we are really trying to bring in new researchers into this space. One of our primary functions has been to try to support new research in this space across different disciplines, particularly research that can address open questions regarding the psychological causes and consequences of poverty. So in this past year, actually the whole history of SIGA, we've supported something like 35 to 40 projects, including both exploratory studies as well as larger scale projects. And these have been led by researchers from a variety of different disciplines, so different areas within economics, business, political science, psychology, public health, as well as public policy. And we will be announcing a 4th funding competition later this spring, so stay tuned for that. Through PEP, we've also supported a couple of ongoing projects here led by researchers here at Berkeley. One is led by Professor Kaur, which is called Seasonal Hunger in Zambia. And that project basically is trying to employ insights from psychology to help small-scale farmers better save from their harvests and plan for the future. And the second is what we call the East Bay Financial Needs Study. And the goal of that study is to explore how alleviating financial scarcity for low-income families might actually affect how parents are able to engage with their children. So a little more just about our agenda for today. As you see on the agenda, we'll have 3 sessions. They focus on mental health, theoretical work on the psychology of poverty, and as well as the impact of financial stress and cash transfers. We'll also have a lightning talk session at the very end, where we'll hear about scalable projects that have been funded by the agency funds. And this is also a great opportunity for those folks to get some feedback on kind of their early work. And yeah, so now I'll turn it over to our program manager, Christina Halez, who will give you some more information about the logistics, question and answer, and so on. Okay, and Christina will also introduce our amazing keynote speaker today, Phil Fisher from Stanford. Thank you.
Thanks, Mahesh. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. Just a few housekeeping rules, ground rules. There's going to be a short Q&A after each presentation, and then a longer moderated discussion and Q&A after each session. So hold your questions until that time. For attendees joining remotely on Zoom, you can put your questions in the Q&A, and time permitting, we'll read them aloud for presenters to respond to. And a SIGA staff member is going to monitor speaker time. So you'll get 5 minutes, 90 seconds, and 30-second time warnings for our speakers. So now I'm really excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Philip Fisher. He's the Excellence in Learning Professor at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. He has a very long history of advancing an integrative understanding of developmental science and its relevance to early childhood policy and practice through his work in the Center on the Developing Child and through the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child at Harvard. And he's also got an extensive range of NIH-supported research at the University of Oregon. So his research focuses on developing and evaluating scalable early childhood interventions in communities. And that's why we thought this was a really great overlap with the work that we do in the PEP community. And he works on translating scientific knowledge regarding healthy development under conditions of adversity for use in social policy and programs. So he's recently moved to Stanford to direct the new Stanford Center on Early Childhood. So excited to hear about that. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Phil Fisher. I think you should be good to go. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody hear me okay? Terrific. Thank you to Mahesh for the invitation, and to Siga for hosting me, and Christina for dealing with my last minute slides that actually came in like this morning, about 5 minutes before the talk. This is a bit of an unusual talk for me in the sense I was telling Leah that I usually have a pretty clear sense of stuff that I'm talking about that's all from kind of prior research that I've been putting together. This talk is very fresh, and there's a lot of new work integrated into it, including the work of others. So you probably will see times where I stumble a little bit when I'm presenting some of the information because it's my first time and because it's other people's work. But fortunately, at least in terms of the work that I'm going to be talking about that Mahesh and his colleagues and Leah have developed, they're here to correct and set the record straight anywhere I go. I go off the rails. So the talk is really focused. Oops, let's see. Just want to make sure we're advancing. Can I advance just with the?
Yeah, you can. It's weird. Should be working. Should be.
Yes.
There we go.
Good, good.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Great. This talk is really a focus on, given that the center and this meeting is about economics and poverty and child well-being, it's really about how we can bring these things together. And a lot of it focuses on what's been happening since the pandemic in terms of policies and programs for families with young children in the US, and how those policies and programs intersect with data that exists, including a lot of our data on the well-being of children and families. I think what we want to really be able to do in this talk is just, first of all, map on our understanding as well as we can of how the policies that have been in place seem to be affecting families, both in terms of their economic circumstances and then also in terms of well-being that we see in families. So that means how parents are doing, how kids are doing, how the parenting environment is being affected by these things. The goal of where I want to get by the end is really to talk about how all of this information provides us with great opportunities to really think about next generation of work in this area. And also, I want to present, and again, this is a bit far afield and there's nobody here to correct me on this, some of the work that we're doing with the Frameworks Institute, which is why Nat Kendall Taylor is one of my co-authors, on the topic of culture change, because in a lot of ways, we can think about policies and programs, we can think about developmental research, but it's also how culture defines a lot of the issues that we're interested in, how members of society think about issues of poverty and think about issues of economic benefits that have a lot of potential to drive whether there's actually impact from all this knowledge that's accumulating. So I really want to integrate that into the sort of latter parts of my talk. I suspect, given this audience, that many of you have already seen this article about all of the policies that were in place over the course of the pandemic. I just superimposed this with a graph for the first couple of years of the pandemic of the various surges in COVID-19 infection rates, so that you get some sense of just the volatility of the kind of public health context in this country that kind of ebbed and flowed over time. But if you overlay that with the benefits that were put in place during the pandemic, there are a variety of programs that were implemented either immediately or in the ensuing months or subsequent year or two of the pandemic that were really, in a lot of ways, what we might consider something of a natural experiment, where you had this global disruption and then all of these financial mechanisms that were put in place and other benefits to try to help keep families and individuals afloat. And since our work is at the Center on Early Childhood, and I focused on early childhood, what I'm going to be shifting to in a couple of minutes is just how these programs may have had an effect on families with young children in this country. But you can see unemployment benefits came and went. There were a variety of benefits for specifically for children and families, most of which have come and gone. You can see a lot of food assistance programs that were put in place at the beginning, some that subsequently came in place, some that have or just are just about to end, and others that look to be, at least for now, have no expiration date. And then finally, you can also see a variety of policies that were implemented to try to make sure that people continue to have access to healthcare and not only preventing evictions and mortgage foreclosures, but also ways to actually get money into the hands of people to pay for housing. So those were all the policies that were put in place. I want to note, because this will come back up again at the end of my talk, when I see articles like this, I'm always interested in the comments, because you know, it's, if you want to get a sense of sort of how people are feeling about an issue, even though the New York Times has a generally left of center readership, there's still all kinds of comments that you can see. And so here is a comment that sort of underscores the importance of why we should be paying attention to these things and sort of where we're putting our efforts in. But please pay attention to the sort of tone of this message, because this is a very problematizing way of considering the problem. And it's also fairly fatalistic, right? Like when you read this, you say, this is an accurate representation of things, perhaps. I support the idea that these policies were good and should have been kept in place. And yet, when you read it, you don't necessarily think, oh, well, we can fix this particular situation. Similarly, somebody who might write in and say something kind of not so supportive of this concept, similarly sort of has a sense of like, well, in a tongue-in-cheek way, here are some things that we can do, but good luck. Good luck, you know, changing these policies that many of us might find objectionable. Good luck changing people's minds about these things. So whether people are supportive or not supportive, one of the things that's quite noteworthy here is the extent of fatalism about sort of the state of the situation. One of the points that I hope to make in the context of this talk is that this is not a hopeless situation. In fact, I think, at least amongst a lot of the people that I've been talking to and the work that we're doing at our center, we have a sense of optimism that the disruption that was caused, even though it has continued to wreak havoc and will have long-term effects on individuals, especially those exposed to structural, historic, racial, and ethnic inequalities and other disparities, that there are opportunities to make change, and that culture is actually changing in a way that has potential for us to see benefit. But let me shift now, because what I want to do is, against the backdrop of the pandemic policies, share with you some data that we started to collect at the beginning of the pandemic. And in the bio that Christina read about me, one of the things that she talked about was sort of our intervention, development, and evaluation, and how we've focused on programs that have potential to be scalable. When the pandemic started, our work, like many other people's work in that area, was really either put on pause or forced to change in very significant ways. But more importantly, our group asked the question, how can we be useful in the context of this global emergency? What might a developmental and intervention-focused research lab be able to do in the context of all of the circumstances that were unfolding? And our response was to think about really a way to bear witness in a sort of empirically pragmatic, but as rigorous as possible way, to the circumstances of what households with young children would be going through. Because unless you lived in 1918, there was really no accumulated, and especially accumulated, scientific knowledge base about the experiences of households with young children. We were very lucky. We had several philanthropic funders who we talked to in March of 2020. And by April 6th in 2020, we launched our first survey. We're right now we just passed our 3rd anniversary of the survey being ongoing. The goal with the survey was to be very nimble, to be able to get a large sample that was very diverse from across the country. We have aimed for about 1,000 participants each time the survey goes out. In the first 6 months of the pandemic, we collected data on a weekly basis. For somebody whose typical ends in my studies have been like in the maybe 150 that we follow families for 5 years, the fact that we had 1,000 data points coming in on a weekly basis was a little bit mind-blowing. Needless to say, and for those of you who are survey researchers, there are limits to the the granularity of the data that you can collect. But nevertheless, with the frequency and the size of the sample, we felt like we were really able to begin to make headway in telling the stories of what families would be going through. So the way the survey works is it's administered by smartphone or tablet computer. All you need is a cellular connection to be able to take it. It takes about 15 minutes. We pay people for their participation. It's available in English and Spanish, and more recently in other languages. One thing that I want to note, I won't be presenting data during this talk on it, but we also added in a year later a parallel national survey of the early childhood and childcare workforce, because we knew that if we really wanted to be holistic and we were interested in child well-being, if you're interested in a whole child well-being, parents are critical, but other adults, especially those who care for children in both formal and informal, licensed and unlicensed center and home-based childcare settings, are also critical to the well-being of children. And in fact, understanding the well-being of those individuals is central to, I think, developing a holistic system of support. To date, we've surveyed over 16,000 families in all 50 states. We've also got 3,200 or more providers. We've launched 100 surveys, actually more than that to date. The surveys have moved from weekly to monthly, and they continue on a monthly basis moving forward. One of the things that I'll highlight really quickly is that very early on, we realized we needed both quantitative and open-ended questions, because quantitative can tell you a lot about what, but the open-ended questions can tell you a lot about why things are going on along the lines of what you find. We've had over 300,000 responses to our open-ended questions. If you ask people, especially in a way that's then reflected back to them through newsletters, through other means of communication, people are very eager to tell you what's going well and what's not. And I think that is, especially as somebody who's done a lot of laboratory-based research, survey research that really is aimed at bearing witness and reflecting things back and making handoffs to policy, I think is welcome by people. It doesn't have to be by nature extractive. It can be really a powerful tool. And we've used a variety of new methodological tools involving topic modeling to be able to analyze the themes of those 300,000 questions. So they furnish us with powerful quotes when we're kind of working with policy and advocacy folks, but they also have provided us with really valuable empirical data. Happy to talk, not in this talk, about the topic model. The rapid survey really tries to create a surround sound picture of what households with young kids are going through. So we ask questions in all of these 5 domains and have, as I said, been learning a lot in terms of how things have evolved over time. I'm going to start right now by talking about the data on material hardship that we've been accumulating over time. I'm sure everybody knows, but material hardship is a measure that researchers have increasingly been using in addition to or over and above measures of income or federal poverty level. There are a multitude of reasons for this that I won't get into again in great detail, but really hardship is a way of understanding whether families are able to acquire what they need to live. So that means food, paying for utilities, housing, and so forth. It's been a very important and sensitive measure that we've been collecting over time. So when we ask about material hardship, we ask about whether in the past month families have been able to pay for what they need in each of the following categories. And then what we've been doing is tracking the extent to which families report having one or more hardships during this time. So here's the data. And this is very chilling. It's been sort of hard to absorb this, especially when we read the open-ended responses across time. The first thing is that given that this is a national sample and quite diverse, when we started the survey at the very outset of the pandemic, 1 in 3 families reported that they couldn't pay for basic needs in one of these areas in the past month. So that just is a sign of, and you'll hear more about this when I present or try to present a little bit of Leah's work, the rates of poverty, of child poverty in this country in terms of the challenges. What we saw initially at the beginning of the pandemic, so in the spring of 2020, is that those rates went up. They kind of moved more in the 35, 37%, then they dropped. And this is a kind of an exciting looking decrease, and I'll talk a lot more about it in this talk. But I think one of the things that's noteworthy is that still, even when we were kind of at our best, our data showed that about 1 in 4 families still could not pay for at least one area of basic need. It was actually utilities that were the most common basic need that people were not paying for. Our open-ended questions suggested that was because people buy food and pay their rent first, and then they don't have enough money left over for utilities. This is what's happened in the last year and a half, which is that whatever was working appears to not be working. And we've seen a very steep increase in the rates of hardship to where now we've been hovering at or just above 40% of families that can't pay for at least one basic need during this time. Data are also chilling in terms of what we see again as evidence of historical structural racial inequalities. So Black and Latinx households in our survey consistently report higher rates of material hardship. One of our findings, it's very strong evidence of the racial wealth gap, is that even among Black and Latinx families that were reported being at middle and upper income levels before the pandemic, many of those families fell into poverty. Lots of good literature on the wealth gap that can help explain that. But what you can see is that really in excess of more than half of the families from many of the time points in the survey that are Black and Latinx have experienced difficulty paying for basic needs. Also, where people were before the pandemic has had a huge impact. So you can see that amongst people who are above 400% of the federal poverty line, the rates of hardship have been relatively low. And in terms of the sharp increases that we've seen in the overall sample, there is some increase in that subgroup, but not nearly what we see in those who are lower income. So again, not everybody has been having the same experiences during the pandemic. In spite of the very powerful collectivist idea that we're all in this together, many people would say we have not been in the same thing together. So now I'm just going to put these two pieces together of what the policies have shown over time and or what policies have been implemented over time and our trends of hardship. I'm making a strong disclaimer that these are visualizations. This is not experimental data. So it's more like, what are the policies that were in place and how might they coincide with the trends that we're seeing? But these were fun slides to make. So here is the trend of overall hardship. So this is just across all areas that I just showed. And here is a policy timeline showing when unemployment benefits got put in place, at least some of them to begin with. And you can see that some of the initial unemployment changes, maybe they kept things from going into total free fall because of the number of people that were forced out of work during this time. By the way, there is a tremendous gender bias in terms of who was forced to leave jobs. Many, many more women left, have not re-entered the workforce. Even those who could afford to leave work and either were forced to or they're shut down, there was a tremendous increase in distress. So just want to make that particular note. But here's where we begin to see some interesting real coincidence of some of the policies. In particular, child tax credit and EITC expansion is where we see, after we had some of these other policies and benefits in place, where we see the greatest drop. And then what you see on the right-hand side of this graph is really where we began to see consumer prices go up dramatically. And it appears that that had some mitigating effect, a pretty significant mitigating effect on the rates of hardship. Here's housing. You can see a very similar trend. This is just people reporting that they couldn't pay for housing. So it's just one piece of that hardship. And what you can see here is, again, the moratoria may or may not have had an impact on ability to pay for things. Although certainly some people were foregoing paying their rent and mortgages during this time. But it's really where we see the assistance, rental assistance and vouchers coming in, that we see the greatest coincidence with the reductions in hardship. Food hardship, we measured both with a single question: did you have enough money to pay for food? We also have inserted USDA questions that is a 6-item scale about hunger. You can see that it's a little bit more sensitive to fluctuations. Again, where you want to look is where the trends begin to decrease, is where we see food benefits, SNAP in particular, and WIC increases, that we see things moving in the right direction. So again, sort of some strong indication that there is a coinciding of the onset and offset of government-related policies with rates of hardship, that some, but not all, of the pandemic-related unemployment and child and family-based assistance policies coincided with reduced material hardship. Some housing policies, especially those involving assistance, coincided with reduced housing hardship rates, and some food assistance benefits coincided with reduced hunger and food insecurity. And, you know, this is another New York Times article by Jason DeParle that I think created, again, was sort of divisive in terms of how people responded to it. But the main point of his article was that, in fact, if you look at policies aimed towards child poverty over time, his data that he reported from Child Trends suggests that these policies do have potential to have impact on child poverty rates. And so we should be paying attention to them. And yet, you know, our data don't necessarily show that, you know, that all the policies can offset all of the kinds of economic forces, and that when policies end, they make a difference in terms of increasing rates. And yet here we are at a point where now a lot of these benefits are about to go away. So why should we be concerned about this? As economists, or as like compassionate people, for sure, as developmental psychologists, I think I just want to dig a little bit deeper. So first, I want to talk about the extent to which when we think about material hardship, we should also think about parenting and parent well-being. Okay, here we go, Mahesh. And are your co-authors here? Because I want to acknowledge them as well. Okay, well, anyway, I love this paper. I visited here a couple of months ago. Mahesh told me about it. I was very excited. So there is a whole literature on how lower income households speak and engage in less language-rich environments with their children. It's really generated, dating back to when Hart and Risley reported this in the 90s, a whole industry of research and of intervention work that if people just talked, if they knew that it was good to talk more to their kids, that they would do so. It's not just quantity, but quality. And there has been a tremendous amount of federal and philanthropic funding to support these programs. The question is that really the mechanism? Is poverty, is the mechanism underlying poverty that people just don't know well enough? Or might there be something else that's going on? And especially in the context of hardship, I think one of the questions is, how might lack of access to resources and scarcity impact people's communication and just use of language? And so this is 2 studies, one of which used a really great experimental design, which Mahesh can tell you more about, but essentially prompted people to reflect on scarcity and then looked at whether there was a reduction in their use of language with 3-year-olds, and in fact there was. And the other is a really brilliant analysis of the time of the month in which LINA, which is digital data that's collected in natural environments, was collected, and found, at least, and I think this is super intriguing for middle and upper income families, that time of the month was associated with, so as you get further in the month, presumably when financial resources are diminishing, that you get less, do I have this right, quantity and quality, or is it just conversational terms?
This is just from the LINA metric,
Yeah.
which is how much are the parents and kids engaging in conversation.
Okay, so this is conversational turns diminished based on time of the month. Love to talk more about that. And you can see this is a really, I think, elegant model that suggests that historically we've really thought about the this phenomenon of lower income as a both a kind of innate tendency and around parenting beliefs and knowledge that we need to change, and that there are these other issues that we need to fix in children. This suggests that maybe some of the structural factors that we've historically thought are very distal to all of these things may be more proximal. I think this is a fascinating area of work. I want to note, just a small side note, our data on hardship among the early childhood workforce suggests much higher rates of hardship than for parents of young kids. And so when we think about quality of care, which is a common discussion in terms of thinking about child well-being and childcare, and we typically think, oh, quality is poorer in lower income providers and family, friend, and neighbor because they don't know enough, et cetera, et cetera. It may be that we want to begin to explore these questions further, which is one of the things I want to talk to you about. Okay, why else should we be concerned? Our own data looks at what happens not only in terms of what to material hardship as it relates to parent well-being, but then how that subsequently relates to child well-being. So first of all, if you're familiar with the ACEs study, more adverse childhood events is related to more distress. Again, a whole industry of research and intervention has been created around that. Our research on hardship suggests that more hardships, the more areas that people report they can't pay for things, the more they report that they're distressed and that their children are distressed. But I think more importantly, we've run mediational analyses so that this is not, our rapid data is not a strictly longitudinal study. It's sort of, again, this pragmatic hybrid of longitudinal and cross-sectional. We continuously recruit people into it, but we are able to do longitudinal analyses because of the sample size and a variety of multivariate statistical modeling approaches that we use. And what we found is that the association between financial hardship and parents' reports of children's distress is mediated in a temporal way through caregiver distress. So if at a given time a parent says, I can't pay for basic needs, when we follow them up in subsequent weeks, they have increased distress. And when we follow them up in weeks later, then that's when we begin to see increases in their reports of children's distress. So it's a temporally mediated relationship, again, in the context of perhaps less than optimal data. Another factor which we're particularly obsessed with these days, as is the field of early childhood adversity, is unpredictability. So when we have actually computed a measure, this is work that my colleague Sihang Liu has been doing, of hardship unpredictability, the extent to which from one time point to the next, you report that you can or can't pay for basic needs. And when you compute that coefficient, it turns out that unpredictability adds to both caregiver and child distress as reported by parents. So unpredictability is another factor impacting outcomes. And Sahang and I have proposed, this is just an extension of many of the translational neuroscience models that a variety of people have worked on over the years, that unpredictability, especially at the level of the family, but in fact, at all levels, and we're starting to measure it from micro to macro levels, can really potentially impact the underlying neurobiological development of children, in particular, probably because of the way in which it creates adaptive alterations in a lot of the peripheral biological stress response systems. But there's a result, a reason to really be concerned about the extent to which unpredictability, in addition to insufficiency of access to resources, may be placing an added burden on children and families. And it's one of the reasons that I think these policies and programs that I think a lot of you know a lot more about than me, that create stability, can really be critical for promoting well-being. The one just little positive, bright spot in this, because I know I'm presenting a lot of sort of challenging information, is that one of the ways that we found that that hardship was actually moderated was the extent to which parents report that their home environment is predictable and that they're experiencing quality time with their kids. So, and that's sort of a consistent finding of how do you moderate some of these effects of stress through the immediate parenting environment. So We report these very high rates of hardship that are not equal across the whole population, that the policies had some impact on. We now can say from our data, and of course, again, from much prior data, that when hardship and unpredictability exist, that they pose significant challenges for the psychological well-being of parents and then subsequently for children, and that these kinds of effects can have lifelong impacts on health, on social and emotional development, and other aspects of mental health and well-being. I think the other thing that we really need to be sensitive to, again, coming back to Mahesh, is the idea that hardship may be a mechanism that's impacting a lot of the immediate natural environment qualities that we may not necessarily be targeting in the most effective ways if we think about how scarcity might also impact the nature of those natural environments. So how should we use all of this information that I just presented to think about future policy? This is a very urgent issue. And many of you may know about this, but there's currently a very large and quite well publicized, would be the best way to put it, study that's going on, which is a randomized clinical trial of unconditional cash transfers. In this country, there was a big splash in the research world and in the media about some of the initial effects from the 1-year assessment of this cash transfer study, which showed some changes potentially in some underlying markers of brain activity using electroencephalography. There was also huge pushback about that particular set of findings. What I find fascinating about this is, just like the thumbs up, thumbs down I showed originally, this is a very complex and challenging issue to address, because I think most people who are progressive simply believe that cash will make a difference in people's lives. And so there's this huge confirmation bias issue that we're dealing with. And I think as we really understand as scientists what these studies are telling us, there's a tremendous amount that we can learn. But I've personally been concerned about how many people who haven't read the studies, who haven't read the critiques of the studies, say, isn't it great that we're finding that when you give people money, kids' brains get bigger? Like so the urgency is that we need to understand this, and we need to be talking about it in ways that are communicating kind of more responsibly what we know about this. And I think all of you in this room can help do that. The reality of that study is that, and this is the conceptual model driving it, is their hypothesis is that unconditional cash will have an impact on kids mediated through these two pathways. One is investing more in kids, the other is reducing stress. The main finding to date, as I mentioned, has been this controversial finding about brain development. But RCTs are mechanism experiments. As economists, as developmentalists, we know that. And so part of the question, where really we just have to say that the jury is out, is, do we have evidence that the cash transfers are impacting how parents spend their money, whether that's creating decreased stress in the environment around the child, and whether those are the particular things that might be driving any of the findings. What's happening is that study is ongoing. I should say, as a disclaimer, I'm on the scientific advisory board of that study. But I just want to note that as the 4-year data come out, these are important questions to be asking. Are the mechanisms that are hypothesized being targeted, are those driving changes? And how much can we responsibly say about that? So I just really want to put that out there. So, okay, so that's like and I think part of the reason, and Aaliyah and I talked a little bit about this, there was recently the SRCD annual biennial conference. Some of you may have been there. There were a bunch of talks about the stuff that we were talking about federal policies and tax credit and SNAP benefits. And those meetings were typical SRC meetings where the room was like this size, and we kept on having to say, come up to the front, because like it was pretty empty. And the baby's first year's presentations were standing room only. And again, that's great in the sense that this is drawing in a lot of people's attention. But I would say, as researchers, there is a huge scientific knowledge base, extant one, that we can learn from. And I think we need to be looking at the full picture rather than kind of just being enamored with one very large study. So anyway, this is where I turn to Leah, because she has done for many years synopses of what we understand about how economic policies can make a difference. And in the context of that work, one of the things that we can see is that child poverty and food insecurity are, the US does not rate very well in terms of OECD countries when it comes to the rates of child poverty and food insecurity. The other thing that Leah has been doing is looking at what we can learn from studies that have been done elsewhere on how policies actually might make a difference in reducing child poverty. Please correct me if I'm getting, okay, great. So looking at things like universal basic income, which is a hot topic. And again, beyond baby's first year, even in this country, there are tons of UBI experiments going on right now in communities. Targeted programs that target specific subsectors of the population, conditional cash transfers, other programs that promote work and earnings, and skipping to the end, basically what we can learn from other countries appears to be that if we focus on food and on tax credits, that those seem to make a big difference. We continue to think a lot about food benefits in our studies because of the very high rates of hunger and the devastating effects that that can have on children's healthy development. The idea that we might specifically target low-income families seems to be really worth considering. The ideas that have been tried elsewhere of universal child allowances, and then simply increasing our investments in low-income families with young children appear to all be strategies that really seem to have evidence to support them. How'd I do? Is that okay? Okay. And ask Leah if you have any questions. Okay, the other thing I want to push, and this is really one of the places that our center is strongly focused, is cash. If you think about main effects of studies, then needless to say, the policies will really get you a long way. Greg Duncan, who's one of the PIs and kind of the brainchild of the baby's first year studies, frequently says policy is a blunt instrument, meaning you can't have precision policies. Nevertheless, we think that beyond whatever main effects we might see, that we're very concerned about the question of moderators and what works for whom. And so we're very interested in thinking about how we can use other additional supplemental supports beyond economic ones to push things forward further. So this is the work, this is sort of the center of the work at our center right now. We are extending the rapid survey, which has been national, into communities. Communities have approached us and requested that we do this, and they want data on their own kids and families and providers' well-being. As a result, we think that we can use RAPID in communities as a tool for child and family centered design, where we're designing supports and services based on what people are saying is working and isn't working, their assessments of how the systems are or aren't integrated, and so forth. And if we're thinking about this with a systems approach, then we're not talking about let's just fix one aspect of the ecosystem, but how do we put the pieces together? Very much oriented to place-based, but with an eye towards scalability of methods. So best processes rather than best programs or practices. We also are quite certain and have been talking for a long time about how, although RCTs are the gold standard, and you've heard me talk about this before, a lot of our work presupposes that we know what the mechanism is and that targeting the mechanism is going to impact the outcomes when we haven't shown that. And then we engage in and embark on these very large scale studies when we don't know if what we're trying is actually changing the thing that's at the root of what we want to change. So lots of the language interventions that have been out there exhort people to talk to their kids more, and they'll report some finding down the road, like increased preschool or kindergarten attendance. But the reports of whether it actually changed parenting or parent language use are scant in the literature. And that comes from a number of meta-analyses that have been done. So we really think there are a variety of pre-experimental approaches that can be done much more rapidly that will greatly enhance what we're doing. And we think about doing this in the context of communities where we think about how the healthcare system can be stitched together. You can see the healthcare system in dark blue. This is a universal point of access for families with young kids. As they get older, it begins to become less of a frequent point of contact, but that's where the early education environment can come together. So we see that really the stitching together of these two systems surrounded by the other supports and services as being a place to really operate beyond the economic efforts to develop community-specific solutions. Okay, I know I'm running out of time, but I got to get on just a really quick frameworks thing, okay? Great. So my colleague Nat Kendall-Taylor at Frameworks has been instrumental. Frameworks is known for how to frame issues and how to communicate them effectively. But recently, he's been thinking a lot about how people just construe and think about what is the culture or cultural mindsets around social issues. And they have done a huge amount of communications research where they collect data and just think about what are the ways in which people think and talk about social issues. One of the biggest concerns is that a lot of tendencies, and you saw this in some of those comments I showed at the beginning, are very much around sort of ingrained culture around individualism, which is like pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of mentality. Fatalism, there's nothing we can do. And otherism, which is it's not my problem. I know these issues exist, but somebody else has to fix it. But these things exist along a continuum. So if you think about individualism, there's a way to think about more collectivist and contextual issues. You think about fatalism, you can think more about the potential for progress. And rather than otherism, it's somebody else's responsibility, it's all of our responsibilities. One of the things that their research has been showing is that there are a variety of these dimensions that are actually in flux. They're not, so even though we may say we're a very individualistic culture, in fact, you think about the beginning of the pandemic and how there was this big move to let's get through this and pull together, and then this immediate pushback, so these things move around a lot. If you think about how people feel about systemic racism these days, it's really moved from racists are individual people to it's built into the system and we need to address the system. And so if you think about how these things moving around and their volatility, and you begin to measure those things, that has a lot of potential to further inform how we're talking about particular topics like the ones that I've been talking about, and potentially best ways and times to communicate and move the needle. And so I'll leave you with this, which is that a lot of times, all of us who are trained in academia talk about things as problems. We often talk about things in terms of, you think about this 2x2 matrix in terms of urgency and what we can do about them. We talk a lot about the significant problems and how terrible they are. And again, that was reflected in those New York Times comments. When we talk about things as there's a lot we can do, but it's, these are going to take a long time, you really don't have a lot of increase in motivation. Where things really get good is where you talk about things as being highly urgent and where there's a lot that you can do. And so I hope that in the context of this talk, that's what I've convinced you. That is, in fact, we know a lot. There are a lot of policies and programs that we can learn from, including ones in the US, but also ones elsewhere that can help us identify what we can do that can make a difference in terms of economic well-being and subsequent child development. And there's a huge opportunity right now to be able to engage in those things further. So I'll skip ahead here. This is the advisory council that's been supporting the work on the RAPID survey. Here we have some funders and some of our key partners. This work would not have been able to be done without a huge number of community organizations with which we work. And here's how you can learn more about me and us. All right, like 20 seconds over.
Time for the 10-minute Q&A.
Anyone have a question?
Thank you. I found that fascinating. One thing I was just wondering about is sort of how bounded the effects are. And I was thinking of other countries, and you showed one slide of OECD countries, which were much better off in the treatments, and presumably having a positive effect on children. And I was wondering, a lot of people I think in this room probably work in poorer countries and situations where there's a lot more instability, a lot less issue, and how those things impact the kids, and whether there's sort of just a linear relationship between how bad things get and how badly they impact the kids, or whether there's some kind of curve to that. That's what I was interested in.
So when you're asking about this, it has to do with the extent to which we see unpredictability and kind of insufficiency in contexts that might be more extreme than we see here in the US, and how those things might have impacts. Is that the question?
No, it's more about, are the impacts bounded in some way? I mean, is it that there are, poor people with instability in the United States might be less poor or less unstable than somebody in South Sudan, for example? Are the impacts on the children concomitant with those differences, or is there some sort of bounded rate of the impact? Am I making myself clear?
I think so. I'm going to give it a stab, and then I may have to rely on some colleagues to answer that question, especially who've done work in these other places. The neuroscience research that I'm familiar with, which includes research on non-human primates and rodents, as well as the human research, is really about the immediate care environment. So, for example, Tali Barum and colleagues at UC Irvine have developed, I think, a really powerful paradigm that's called fragmented care, in which what they do with a rat is, with a rat that has just given birth, they remove a certain amount of the nesting material from the environment, which then causes the rat dam to become very preoccupied with building a nest. And in that context, the care, the sort of standard care, is really interrupted. It's unpredictable. It's because there is this big preoccupation with building the nest, it becomes very difficult for the environment to become predictable. And that paradigm has shown many different effects on both learning and on underlying stress biology. And so I think that, at least for the way a lot of people are thinking about this, if you think about how the immediate care environment, and I'm not just talking about maternal care, but again, adult care, allows to create a buffering kind of surrounding of the child in spite of some of the larger contextual factors that might be going on. I think that's where we see the greatest potential for kind of these effects being mitigated, where the larger context around the individual, and this points again to some of Mahesh's research, is impacting the care environment, is where we see greater potential for there to be disruption of the type that we're talking about. And we can even see that there's a great study that Natalie Brito at NYU did recently, looking at unpredictable noise in the environment of the child, and finds, using the same EEG methods that the Baby's First Year study used, that unpredictable noise has a detectable effect on brain activity in infants. So I think it's worth thinking about sort of the care environment, how it impinges on the child, what role adults in children's lives have to buffer, and where we see things really falling apart, which makes a lot of sense, is where the environment becomes so unpredictable, non-contingent, and non-responsive, that it's very difficult for children to make sense of cause and effect. And I think that's where there isn't necessarily a lower bound, but certainly there are lots of good scientific studies on how those effects can be mitigated. Anything to add?
If I could.
Yeah.
I'll just add one thing. Since I have the mic, can I quickly say something about the OECD country study? The other big takeaway from that study that we learned was that the US spends the least on children and families, second only to Turkey, of all the OECD countries, even though our absolute spending is high because we have so much expenditure on Social Security and Medicare. So we spend a lot compared to other OECD countries, but not on families. But I would just to quickly add to what Phil said about the what's happening in very low income context is absolutely worse for kids, right? Because they don't have water, sanitation, access to food, access to safety. So there's instability, but that said, it's absolutely in absolute terms, it's much worse. That said, there's also opportunity for optimism because there are, for example, widespread initiatives to provide parenting support. For example, in refugee communities, if you've seen those ongoing studies where it's parenting support, nutrition support, that really can help buffer children, even in an environment that's very stressful for them. So I think it's not without hope, but there's still a long, long way to go when it comes to kids in low and middle income countries who are facing just a vast array of risks and adversities that kids in this country and other OECD countries don't see.
Thank you so much. We have a question from the Zoom chat.
Oh, okay.
One of them is there evidence whether temporary cash transfers given in the context of RCTs could create more distress / unpredictable future because parents know that at some point that benefit will stop? That's one. And then the other one is during a PhD, they worked on a parent-oriented language intervention to increase quantity and quality of child-directed speech. And the literature assumed that the link between child-directed speech and child outcomes is causal, despite very little evidence that it's actually causal. Can you give an example of a pre-RCT method to understand mechanisms such as this?
Those are like two completely different questions.
Yeah.
This is like a memory test.
Yeah.
The first one was about evidence
Yes.
whether, yeah, you have it.
Right. So I would encourage you to connect with the investigators on Baby's First Years about that question. I can't cite it, but I know of some evidence that increased cash through cash transfers has potential to increase distress in those who are receiving it. Whether the mechanism is well understood or not is a big question. But without digressing too far, I will say that to me, that question is a fascinating one. Like, this is what the science is all about. One of my really impactful early experiences was a colleague who was doing intervention to prevent adolescent substance use. This is Tom DeShawn's work. And he did a parent group only because there was a lot of emphasis on parenting as a key impact sort of mechanism. Then he did peer groups to teach them drug refusal skills and so forth, or control. So it was parent group only, parent group plus peer group, and control. The assumption was that if you do parent and kids together, you're going to get a bigger effect, followed by parent only, followed by the control. What he found was that basically the biggest likelihood of risk for substance use was in the parent and peer group, the condition that was essentially the highest dosage. And instead of suppressing or burying that finding, he looked into it. And it turned out, with a variety of qualitative approaches, that putting a bunch of high-risk adolescents who are already very interested in each other's kind of antisocial behavior together in a group, that the contingencies that they create with themselves overpower whatever a group leader might do. And they were going out and finding places to acquire and use drugs afterwards. Sometimes our best hypotheses are not confirmed by the data. And to me, that is like the best kind of situation to go forth and understand better. And so any of you that are students, the other thing I would say is Tom DeShawn got super famous because of this finding. He did. He basically said, I thought this would work, more would be better. And it turned out to be the opposite. And again, a whole generation of studies looking at unintended negative consequences of things that you do was born. So I think it's a really important question. I don't know if I have time for the other one, and I don't remember it. Oh, I know. It was about mechanism studies. There are a variety of mechanism studies, in particular in the parenting literature, not so much the language development literature. There are a variety of studies that have come out of the social learning tradition that suggest if you target parenting practices that are known to increase the likelihood of disruptive behavior over time, that have to do with positive warmth and reinforcement, and also effective but non-punitive limit setting, you can change those things. When you change those things, you reduce child problem behavior, disruptive behavior in early childhood through adolescence. So there is plenty of evidence of targeting mechanisms as producing outcomes. What I was suggesting is that you need to establish those linkages before you begin to engage in the RCT, especially if you're going to spend 5 years and millions of dollars or longer pursuing an experimental design, because it just sets you up for the kind of confirmation bias that I think all of us, including me, I should say, are very prone to. Like you believe in your ideas and you believe that what you're doing is going to work. So I think that was my point there. One question.
You talked about parents. I was wondering whether you have enough data to talk about mothers and fathers.
No, I don't. It's a great question. The question was, do we have enough data to talk about mothers and fathers? The survey, in order to acquire the samples that we do, we have worked with community organizations, national organizations to get participants. We have not specifically sought fathers, and the vast majority, like 90% of our survey takers, are mothers.
Because I was going to say the traditional old-fashioned system is you put all the hardships on the fathers.
Yeah.
And let the mothers worry about the kids.
Mhm.